Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this new video in which we are finally going to cover the last chapter of What We Owe to Each Other by T.M. Scanlon. Here Scanlon is going to address one of the biggest issues surrounding anyone who tries to offer an account of morality, meaning how morality works and how we can determine if something is right and wrong, and that is basically the problem of relativism. As he opens this chapter with, anyone who offers an account of the morality of right or wrong is bound to be asked whether he is claiming that there are universal moral principles. So, a universal moral principle is basically what a relativist would deny. Universal morality is like the nightmare for relativism, and that's because a universal morality is something that can be scary, knowing how some people would instrumentalize it in order to oppress others. When you claim that you have universal morality on your side, that's kind of a red flag. And so relativists are often passionate deniers of universal morality, and some relativists would even positively assert that they are relativists with a superior attitude. Like they are proud of being relativists and they demean you because they paint you as naive, stupid, while they are the cynical realist that understands that there is nothing fair about the world and it's time to grow up and see reality as it is without the Santa Clauses of morality. So this chapter is about addressing this problem. We are going to see if indeed there are no universal moral principles like the relativists claim, but we are also going to see that Scanlon contractualism doesn't really reject relativism because moral relativism is, after all, a philosophical position that has a lot of literature in its favor. So it has very good points and we cannot just rule it out. So contractualism is going to be a middle ground between these two positions. There are universal moral principles, but they are flexible enough to satisfy the demands of relativists, as long as they are reasonable, of course. So let's start with the question, what is even moral relativism? Right from the start, Scanlon gives a definition. He says, moral relativism, as I will understand it, is the thesis that there is no single ultimate standard for the moral appraisal of actions, a standard uniquely appropriate for all agents and all moral judges. Rather, there are many such standards. So here, what we mean by relativism is not that we cannot know what is right or wrong, and so there cannot be any standards for morality. It just says that there cannot be a universal or absolute standard for that. Like what is right and wrong is going to be determined by the context. What is right in one context can be wrong in another, and so we can determine if something is right or wrong depending on the appropriate criteria to apply in a given context. Stealing when you are poor, for example, has different implications than stealing when you are rich. The context changed between the two cases, and so we cannot apply the same criteria of right or wrong for them both, as if the differences between the differences in the material conditions of these two people don't play a role in shaping our moral judgments about their action. And Scanlon also gives an example of when, for example, you do not help someone repair their car on the highway. If you don't help them when it's freezing cold outside and they will probably freeze to death, it will be way more serious than not helping them in a country where the climate was mild, or in spring or early summer. But then Scanlon says that if we hold such views, then we are not really relativists, because in both cases, the stealing one and the one in which you don't help the person on the highway, we are talking about an action that is wrong. Like stealing is wrong, but the poor guy isn't going to be open to the same criticism than the rich guy with whom we are going to be extremely severe. So here, we're more talking about universal principles on which we already agree, but we don't apply or we don't react to them in the same way. Quote, a view that allows for such variations in what is right by applying a fixed set of substantive moral principles to varying circumstances is not relativism, but rather what I will call parametric universalism. So, if we agree that X is always wrong, it's always wrong to steal, but we differ on how to react to it, and those differences are expressed by the differences of context, then we are not relativists but parametric universalists. Relativism goes further than this. It's not how we react to the same wrong, but what we consider wrong that differs. In parametric universalism, we agree on the principles, but in relativism, we don't agree on the principles, not on how we react to them. As Scanlon says, moral relativism denies that there is a single set of ultimate substantive moral standards by which all actions are to be judged. But there is something interesting here, and you can and it is actually said a little bit later. The thing that is very interesting is that on the one hand we argue as relativists that there are no ultimate substantive moral standards, like no universal principle that applies to all situations no matter what. But on the other hand, there is a presupposition here. A presupposition means that there is something prior to the judgment that you just said. Like the judgment that you said relies on another judgment that you did not say, and the one that you did not say is often, problematic, and so perhaps more difficult to justify, or maybe it would contradict what you want, and so you don't say it. It's like jumping a step that you know that if you don't jump that step, if you don't skip that step, people can object to you based on it, and so you don't want to give that opportunity for others, and therefore you act as if it is a given, like you take it for granted that everyone already agrees on it. That's a presupposition, and so here's what that presupposition is when you continue with the quote. But it nonetheless presupposes a single normative perspective from which judgments can be made about which principles, including moral principles, people in various situations have reason to regard as authoritative. What this means is that relativism, in order to be able to say that there is no set of universal principle, it needs to have a method to determine that, right? Like there has to be an epistemological criterion that you apply to principles, some sort of test, if you want, in order to determine whether a principle should be applied or not, right? So if someone comes up to you with a principle, as a relativist, you need to put that principle to a test in order to know if it is a universal principle first. If it is a universal principle, then you just rule it out. You say that, well, this is not appropriate. So the problem is that to have such a method, you're gonna need to have a principle to back it up. So someone can tell you, what are your reasons for not accepting my principle as universal? And you say, well, it's because of my method. And then they ask you, well, what makes you think that the method you use is appropriate? And so you are going to give reasons for why the method is appropriate. And if you give your reasons, then with everything that we've seen so far, then you would have a principle. So you are judging principles based on a principle. But that's a relativist principle, which as a relativist you are applying to every single principle that comes your way. And this is what is paradoxical, is that you have a principle to back up your method for assessing principles, but since you are going to apply that to every single principle that comes your way, well, your principle is kind of universalistic here. So we have two issues. First, you hold a normative perspective, which means that for you, principles should abide to the perspective that you have. You are prescribing how principles should go or how they should be applied, and that is, they cannot be authoritarian. And what is universal is authoritarian, in this view at least, and so it goes against the perspective of the relativist. And second, the perspective is based on the principle that you apply to every other principle and therefore to every other situation. And so your principle as a relativist is universal. And therefore relativism is often charged with incoherence. And Scanlon gives the famous way to put it by the philosopher Hilary Putnam, who is mentioned in a footnote. He says, This charge is put in its simplest form when one person says, every judgment is relative, what is true for you need not to be true for me, and someone else replies, so is that judgment just true for you? And so the charge is that when relativism is understood as a perfectly general claim, it appears to undermine itself. But Scanlon is going to say that this charge is mistaken, and that actually relativism has a way of avoiding this charge of incoherence. First, to say that just because moral relativism holds a presupposition about a normative perspective, it is not coherent, that is mistaken. Because relativism is first and foremost a thesis about what we have and do not have reasons to do. If it holds that we have reasons to do things or don't have reasons to do other things, then it has to hold that there is a way or ways to defend those reasons in a coherent way. Like, you don't have to be a universalist to defend your reasons for doing or not doing something. The charge of incoherence seems to imply that a moral relativist cannot defend their reasons for action or belief. Whenever they try to do that, they would, it is implied that they would end up in an incoherence. But that is a misrepresentation of relativism. First, relativism makes a distinction between reasons in general and moral appraisals, and they simply focus on the former one. They argue that whatever is considered wrong is an action that people whose authority to decide on the matter is appropriate. If those people have the appropriate, the appropriate authority, decide that it is wrong, well, then they have the reasons to reject the actions, they have reasons to reject the reasons in favor for that action. Regarding that authority, they say that you cannot have a coherent set of principles that would always reject the reasons for an action that the authority considers wrong. And these are coherent claims. So the charge against relativism as incoherent is kind of dropped. It loses its appeal. But even if moral relativism is coherent, that doesn't mean that it doesn't have other more serious problems. And one of them is what makes people afraid of moral relativism. And this fear can be a paradoxical one, since relativists have as much fear from universalist claims. When tyrants oppress others on the grounds of universal principles, relativists, by showing that the principles are not universal and that there cannot be universal principles, would destroy the power of tyrants. But at the same time, people fear relativists because, well, tyrants can use relativism for the same purposes. Tyrants can do whatever they want, since for them morality is not fixed, right? They can tell you that, all right, for you it's bad that I oppress you, but for me it is not. So I can continue to oppress. And they also can diminish any moral or ethical reform that is more egalitarian on the grounds that those reforms are, after all, relative, right? So in other words, tyrants can be oppressive as relativists as well, and perhaps even more so because, at least in the universalist framework, their power had to be limited by something that would transcend them. They had to abide to something, but now their power only grew. And so this is the fear that Scanlon reports from the philosopher John Locke, who in his famous letter on tolerance, which is a text in favor of religious and moral tolerance, he says, "Lastly, those are not at all to be tolerated who deny the being of a God. Promises, covenants, and oaths, which are the bonds of human society, can have no hold upon an atheist. The taking away of God, though but even in thought, dissolves all." So this is the famous fairy tale, because if you deny God, then you deny morality altogether, and that's a gateway for people killing each other and all of that stuff. Like, we know the fairy tale. But basically, relativists are depicted as people who simply don't care about what is right and wrong, and they can normalize acts that are morally condemnable. Like, killing wouldn't be a problem for a relativist, and this seems to be the understanding of another philosopher, Philippa Foot, which we also mentioned in our chapter on reason, so the first chapter. She says that even though relativists can be right we should nonetheless act as if they are wrong because of the instrumental and practical value of morality. Quote, "We are naturally concerned about the man who doesn't care what happens to other people, and we want to convict him of irrationality, thinking that he will mind about that. It would be more honest to recognize that the should of moral judgment is sometimes merely an instrument by which we, for our own very good reasons, try to impose a rule of conduct even on the uncaring man." So the real challenge here to relativism, it's not that it's just incoherent, but that if it is coherent, then it makes it possible for people who don't care about others to justify their lack of caring. If they have reasons not to care and no reasons to care, then they won't care. If they have reasons to kill and no reasons for not to kill, then they will kill. And so Scanlon mentions another philosopher who advanced this implication. This philosopher is called Gilbert Harman, and he argued that moral relativism would offer Hitler no reason not to kill if he believed killing would be beneficial for him or to advance his own ends. But this doesn't strike Scanlon as a strong objection. After all, if relativism would give such power to tyrants, then why most tyrants didn't adopt relativism? Like most genocidal maniacs have the same fears regarding relativism, and most relativists do accept basic ordinary morality. So it seems that the thesis that moral relativism is an obstacle to tyrants has more evidence in its favor than the one that says that tyrants would use relativism as a tool for further power. But there's another reason why moral relativism is feared, and which can be a better objection maybe to moral relativism than the first objection we stated. And this one is, as Scanlon puts it, the second reason is grounded in the confidence we have or would like to have in our judgment that certain actions are wrong. So this means that when we say that an action is wrong, we'd like to feel confident in our judgment that it is a wrong action, whatever reason can there be for it. If we lose that confidence, like if I lose the confidence that killing is wrong, full stop, I will have the feeling that I'm no longer safe, right? Like maybe someone can have a reason to kill me after all, or maybe I will turn into a cold-blooded murderer. And so the loss of that confidence kind of frightens us, and like we fear that once we open the door to relativism, we will lose our ability to distinguish between right or wrong. And so we will end up accepting acts and beliefs that we know deep down, we know that they are wrong. And we would accept, situations in which it would be easier for someone else to manipulate us to achieve their some wicked intentions or plans. Or worse, we think that if relativism is true, then we think of possible scenarios like if I were born German in the early 1900s, I would be a Nazi or something like that. So if an ought-to-do judgment doesn't apply to someone like Hitler anymore, we feel that something important was taken away. And that is that morality is not something that simply depends on our environment or upbringing or culture. If my culture says that it is okay to kill someone in particular, I don't want to accept it, because then what will make me legit in also condemning the act of killing? And so this is what relativism threatens us with, according to Scanlon. He says, what relativism threatens to deprive us of in such a case is not a source of potential motivation that may help to protect us, but rather, I suggest, the sense that our condemnation of certain actions is legitimate and justified. So in other words, we start questioning ourselves, like, how can I condemn genocides if morality is relevant? Even if the person who committed the genocide wasn't a relativist, what possible condemnation can I give that would be justified if relativism is accepted? And you can think of, you know, victims of genocide, like being a victim of genocide. You wouldn't accept relativism, since it argues that you cannot say that you were entitled to not being treated that way. So when we lose that confidence, it also means that we cannot be sure that if someone mistreats us, for example, we are no longer sure that we can condemn them morally on the grounds that we are entitled to a life of dignity. And so that can be rough on people, especially if they have suffered from abuse. And we can also mention a third problem with relativism, and this problem, which is less threatening than the previous one. This one argues that we can still hold on to our moral standards, like we are not required to withdraw them. We can still feel that our condemnation is legit, but it would still diminish their importance. It can do so because if we can hold to our moral standards, then so can the other person, right? Like we end up with two judgments about morality that are both true, and they cannot conflict with one another. Like if I am short and I say someone is tall, but that same person is called short from the perspective of an even taller person, then both perspectives are true and don't conflict with one another. They just refer to different standards. But moral standards, the problem is that they are not descriptive. They are normative, and so they require an appeal to authority to enforce them. If it were moral to be short rather than tall, then we are obliged to enter into a conflict. And so the point of morality, the point of moral judgments, is precisely it's that they precisely prescribe a way to act and to live. They're not just describing. So if other judgments do the same, then they have to compete with each other in order to become the authority. And so the importance of moral judgments comes from this aspect. They cannot just be true in the sense that they passively describe the state of affairs from the eyes of, you know, some neutral observers. Their importance lies in the fact that they can prescribe and impose a certain conduct that is deemed moral or better than other competing accounts, let's say. So it's like you do a painting and everyone is saying that it is beautiful, but they say the same about other paintings as well. Like whatever you hang on a wall is called beautiful. You begin to wonder if your painting is actually having an impact on those people. Like they can say that it is beautiful and the statement can be true, but if it has no impact on the viewer, what is the point? Or if it is true simply because of a convention, like these people who are judging your work decided on their own that your work is beautiful, well, it's way less rewarding than if it was indeed your work that earned you the beauty of your painting, right? If it is just a matter of standards that are artificially made, like it's a social construction, it has this feeling that your work has no value on its own. And it has an impact only if those who made the construct allows it to have an impact. And that can feel demeaning. And so it can be the same shit with morality. We want that. We want our judgments to have an impact, not just a yeah whatever, or you know that's true, but as a merely social or conventional construction. Like relativism is just out there debunking everything we hold as morally valid. But is that really what relativism would lead to? Like, are these threats justified? Well, according to Scanlon, they're not, because again they misrepresent relativists, or they take all the relativists as the same, which is full-on skeptical relativists. Like, sure, a relativist is supposed to be a relativist in the sense in the sense that they are skeptical about moral judgments, but skeptical can mean different things. For the people who are threatened by relativism, skepticism means that you doubt to the point of affirmation that moral judgments can have any importance or significance. Okay, like you doubt that judgments about morality can have any significance. So there are, of course, relativists that would fit the three threats, but as Scanlon says, I believe that many philosophers who defend relativism take themselves to be defending a non-skeptical, or as I will call it, benign relativism, according to which the requirements of morality vary, but are not for that reason to be taken less seriously. So Philippa Foot actually is a non-skeptical relativist. She was just, complaining about those who go full skeptic about morality. And that is what anthropologists would do, for example. Anthropology has this benign form of relativism. When anthropologists tell us to look at the moralities of other cultures, they don't mean it in the way that we cannot take moral standards seriously, but rather to tone down maybe our ideals of superiority over other cultures who may have good reasons to think the way that they did. And that if we are oblivious to that, maybe we too have a sense of morality that will be looked at like we do now when we look at more primitive cultures, but in the future people will look at what we considered right or wrong in the same way that we look today at how people considered things right and wrong in primitive cultures. So the question is how to give a correct account of this benign relativism that doesn't take away the importance we often give to moral standards. And that starts by asking about the reasons that two different people can have to view different standards as having the same moral significance. So let's see what we mean by moral significance in ways compatible with moral benign relativism. According to Scanlon, there are three features to determine the significance. First, there is the significance. The significance means that the agent has reasons to give the moral requirements importance and priority. Remember in chapter 4, about wrongness, we explained that moral requirements have importance and priority in someone's life because they impact my relationship with other people. And so given how big the role that our relationship with others play in the significance of our lives, it's unreasonable to do things that will cost us those relationships. The second feature is that if we violate those requirements, we would feel guilty. And we've already explained what guilt is. We feel like we didn't give others what we owed them. We've seen this in the sixth chapter on responsibility. And then there is the third requirement, which is about the implications that the moral requirements an agent holds have on other people. If an action leads to the harm of someone, but that action was done without violating moral requirements that both parties involved don't see any reason to reject, then the action wasn't wrong. So moral significance means that we consider some values as important and have priority over other values, that if they are violated, that causes guilt in the agent, and that's because they have serious implications on other people. Now the question is, can such significance be given to different standards by different people? So remember, moral relativism argues that different people can give moral significance like we just described to different standards. Well, whether we can do that, we need to be aware that we are talking about moral relativism and not parametric universalism, since that too can fit into this description. If you remember, parametric universalism holds that there are universal principles, but people can apply them differently or react to them differently. But here we want to see if relativism holds. So we want to avoid any kind of universalism, meaning that there cannot be a universal way of ascribing that significance to different standards, or that different people can apply the same principle to different standards and in different ways. We need, quote, a distinction must be drawn between, on the one hand, a conception of what can confer the kind of status that moral principles have, and on the other, a substantive standard on which all other moral principles must be based. But that would be a difficulty. If we take the first option, which is the most relativist of the two, we can end up with a boundless relativism that says that any principle can have moral significance. That would make you a skeptical relativist that says that Hitler's principles can have significance. So it would be necessary to have boundaries for relativism, but those boundaries will be blurry to the point where Scanlon says that it's not clear whether a view can be called relativist or not. And so as a result, views of benign relativism are from the start kind of ruled out. So maybe we need to reformulate our question and ask not whether a view is or is not properly called relativist, but rather what kind of foundation it takes moral standards to have, and how much variation in such standards it allows for. So we ask, when we consider a standard moral, do we have good reasons for that, and how many variations of those standards we can have? So that would be the closest we can get to benign relativism. So for example, can a social convention be enough to make a standard a moral one? Just because that's the standard that people have agreed on, does it make that standard moral? Okay, so the debunking version of benign relativism that we viewed before would say no. Hence the diminishing of the moral significance of those standards. But we can have a non-debunking view, one that doesn't reject moral standards on the basis that they are social constructions, or take them less seriously. If people have a standard that is important in their way of life and they wish to maintain that standard, they can have reasons for giving it moral significance. And similarly, they can have reasons for following other ways of life that they find valuable, and by which we mean traditions and customs. So yeah, just because your morality is a social construction, it doesn't mean that it loses its moral significance. You can make it so that your way of life, or a certain way of life you want to follow, has moral significance. You can do that. If you like to dress in a certain way, express a certain form of a dress, following certain conceptions of family relations, like some whether you like some holidays, a certain history, culture, those can be reasons for you to consider this way of life as having a moral significance, and preferring this way of life over others' ways of life. You can have that preference without asserting that this way of life is superior to others. And so this would be what benign relativism have in mind when they say that morality is relative. You just have good reasons for preferring a way of life without the necessity of saying that it is better in the sense of, it is superior to other ways. And those reasons, those good reasons, can be as simple as, I've been brought up in this way, and I liked it. I liked it so far, and I like it to continue because it has particular meaning for me. So the fact that it has meaning to the person allows this it allows this principle to dodge the parametric universalism, because that would make it that people can have different cultures and different and value different cultures and in different ways. But that's because valuing tradition is some sort of sacred and universal principle. If we say that it's a moral universal principle to always love and prefer the tradition in which you were brought up in, even if at the end you end up with different people valuing different things, it's not relativism. And so what makes it relative is whether the person has good reasons for wanting to follow the culture that they are brought in or to follow another one. I mean, that's how you know that someone really cares about their culture, right? You ask them for their reasons. And so, as Scanlon says, when people start talking in general terms about the value of traditions, they are often on the verge of ceasing to care about their own. So, relativism of this kind can be great to offer people opportunities to care about their cultures because they can provide reasons for why they care. And this is what we called a substantive view of motivation in chapter 4 about wrongness, because the way of life matters to me in particular. It motivates me to look for reasons to justify it, whereas abstract or formal values, for example, would seem too remote. And also, a way of life is something that we share with others. No one has a solitary way of life. Even if one does, its value is derived from its relation to other people or how it affects them. But in the common sense of how the term is used, ways of life are about community, a community that share those ways in which the members share those ways too. So acting contrary to the way of life that I care about explains why I would feel guilty, for example. So ways of life perfectly fit into the three features of significance. They have importance and priority, they trigger guilt when one does something contrary to them, and they involve other people. So it should be perfect for our case. Well, not so fast. As Scanlon points, there are problems with this account of relativism based on ways of life. First, it kind of presents having reasons for our cultural preferences as optional. We see this in the case of when people have reasons to prefer a certain culture. That's great, but when those in that culture don't like that culture, like for example women who are oppressed by the patriarchal nature of their culture, some women can love their patriarchal culture and maybe have good reasons for that, but others certainly don't. So to those women who don't like this culture, these women wouldn't be open to moral criticism if we are relativists. That can be good. It can be a form of tolerance. You don't give hard time to those who are not into your way of life, even in your own community. But that has a double problem actually, which is that most cultures don't want the members who don't abide to those cultures to be spared moral criticism. Like patriarchal societies would judge severely women who don't conform, and that aspect seems to be integral within the way of life itself. So you can't really be a relativist in a culture that suppresses others, because if you are, then you cannot judge those women. But if you don't judge them, then it means that you don't really care about your own culture or its social cohesion, because you know in patriarchy, for example, oppressing women is integral to the culture. And so on the other hand, the woman may be spared the moral criticism that would befall them in non-relativist societies, but that means that their oppressors won't be open to moral criticism either, unless they promote a way of life that condemns the one that oppresses them, and that would be a way of life that is better or superior to the one that they live under. Like, basically, the relativist way of life seems to be unable to explain the special force of moral requirements. Neither the ones who like their ways of life can say to the others that they are missing something important, which can explain why they are not sensitive to the way of life of their community, nor the others can object that it's the other way around, right? So the issue is that if ways of life have their moral significance based on the reasons that people have, and we are contractualists like Scanlon here, well, it means that not all reasons can be good reasons. Like, we can object to your reasons for preferring a certain way of life, which means that there are wrong ways of life. There can be wrong ways of life, and how can we decide which one is wrong without losing the relative aspect here. And that seems to be difficult, right? Like, some would argue that a way of life by itself doesn't give moral significance, like it can account for the first two features, importance, priority, and guilt if violated, but doesn't for the third. If a way of life imposes such a high cost on other people or treat them in a very bad way, that seems to be reasonable enough to say that it doesn't have the requirement to be morally significant. Those who suffer from it have reasons to reject it. But if we are relativists, then we don't have those reasons anymore. And so Scanlon, as Scanlon says, opponents of relativism thus commonly appeal to the possibility that the accepted norms of a society might license conduct which involves treating people in horrible ways. But relativists try to answer this objection. Scanlon mentions Michael Walzer as an example who argues that such examples are not likely to occur. He says that for an institution to be widespread and that can last for a long period of time, it must have some general principles that are accepted by a very wide majority, since its success relies on the lip service it pays to the interest of all of its members. So the way of life in question would have elements that would make the dominated groups comply and the dominant groups maintain their positions. But in order for the dominated groups to comply, the institutions must provide them with an overall protection against some unacceptable acts. Thus, according to this view, only a tiny accidental minority would suffer from time to time horrible treatments, but for the overall population, they would be safe from it. Like, only 1 in 100 women would be burned if her husband dies in Hinduism, but for the overall, we're fine. So this is also called the minimum content of natural law, proposed by the philosopher of law H.L.A. Hart. He means that laws, or natural law in this case, must have a bare minimum that would appeal to all the members of the community. Like, any way of life must have some basic moral requirements that protect the integrity of all of its members, or at least a vast majority. But as you can guess, this view is quite it's actually quite optimistic, as Scanlon says, but he contends that moral relativists do have a point in appealing to the legitimacy of ways of life that we can't really overlook. That point has actually two points in which they're right. First, it's true that ways of life are a stronger provider for moral motivation than abstract or universal principles, of course. And second, they believe that there is a bigger range of moral principles that have legitimate moral force than universalists think. Like, relativists would say that there are way less moral principles than infinity, but there are way more principles than the universalists would claim. And these 2 points is what Scanlon is trying to satisfy with his contractualism, like motivation and a wide range of moral principles. There are way more valid moral principles than just a few universal ones, and they can motivate us in the same way as ways of life, because they are based on the justifiability to other people, and that justifiability shapes our defensible ways of life. And those principles, although they have a universalist aspect, they can answer to the demands of relativists. So let's see to what extent contractualism and relativism are alike. Well, first, as Scanlon says, according to the contractualist view I am presenting, an action that would be wrong in one context might be morally unobjectable in another. So that sounds like a moral relativist position, but the trick here is to know an action would be wrong in one context but okay in another, while it is the same action. Well, we can say that different ways of life explain that through what Scanlon calls the principle of established practice. It says that if a community has principles that one cannot reject, violating those principles for one's convenience is wrong. And so this means that there are many non-rejectable principles. Some would license a certain action while others would prohibit it. If a community has such principles, again, principles that you cannot reject, and that principle prohibits that action, then you cannot do that action. The community has therefore rejected a principle allowing someone to do that action. So an example that Scanlon gives is privacy. If the practice of respecting privacy is well established and members don't see any reason to reject it, then anyone who violates privacy, the privacy of others, is committing something wrong. So we have a principle that says that it is wrong to violate someone's privacy in the absence of special justification, but different cultures consider privacy differently, or have different ways to protect it or to guarantee it. So it seems that the criterion for deciding whether or not to reject a principle is if the society in question needs it or not, or have reasons for wanting its protection. Like in a society without bank accounts, for example, it wouldn't make sense for its members to have principles that protect their bank savings from public knowledge, or for a communist country to establish a principle that guarantees private property, even if a small minority demands it. Such rules don't have to be unanimously accepted in order to be effective. Some people can think mistakenly that respect of privacy is a bad thing, but such people won't be able to justify such claim, I guess. Thus, even if they don't accept the practice still applies to them. This has the advantage of objecting to claims of superiority over other cultures. In some societies, personal liberty is seen as a sacred value that when we look at other cultures that don't value it, we often judge them as inferior, or that in other forms of relativism, it's okay for some people to be deprived of personal freedom since they don't think like we do. This is sometimes you have in the Western world, someone says that the reason why women have less rights in third world countries is because they don't think like we do. There's a weird pretension in this discourse that people from the civilized world know how all of them think, right? So Scanlon argues, on the other hand, his account, on the other hand, he argues that by putting the emphasis on reasons that allow us to avoid making judgments about how other people would think when we didn't go through what they experience, right? If we were living in one of those third countries, we would probably have similar reasons than them. So we're kind of dealing with two famous discourses here. On the one hand, you have the famous universalist discourse, where some country will claim that they have universal principles, that took them out of the state of nature, out of barbarie, out of obscurantism, and they will now bring it to the other uncivilized nation, and we know how that goes. And so you have the relativist discourse, who has the discourse of let's leave those people alone and protect their cultures because they're as good as ours. You'd have people who are being tortured by tyrants, and the relativists will be like, yay, personal liberty isn't for them. We have to respect how they live. They don't think like us, and we must tolerate that. So we also know how that goes, right? So this kind of relativism doesn't actually try to understand the people it claims to protect, because it doesn't consider them as reasonable people. And so, to quote Scanlon, a relativism that fails to take these reasons seriously may be put forward as broad-minded and tolerant, but but it in fact shows a lack of respect for the people in question. The view I am defending allows for this counter-argument because what it takes as fundamental is not what people actually think or want, but what they have reason to want. So, as Scanlon points, this is not a call for interventionism, which is what most relativists always scream when they suspect a universalist discourse. Like the universalist gives himself the right to intervene in someone else's affair because they decide for themselves that it is what's in the other person's best interests. But contrary to this claim, Scanlon doesn't say that he knows what is in the other person's interests. Quite the contrary. Actually, the agency of others is guaranteed since it is their reasons that count and matter. If someone has reasons to accept the principles under which they live, any interventionism would be a violation of that person's agency. So as he says in a footnote, since, as I noted in chapter 6, one of the things people have reason to want is to be able to control their lives in certain ways. What people actually want makes a difference to how they may be treated. So in this account, if interventionism can happen, it won't be like in the case of the universalists to homogenize the population, but rather to respond positively to reasons that we cannot object to from the people living there and who have reasons to object to the principles governing their lives. So such objections don't even need to rely on universal principles either. Like if a society has principles that are violating people's privacy, when they have good reasons to object to it, we don't need to make privacy a universal unalienable right in order to enjoy privacy, right? As we said, privacy can take different forms in different societies. When people of country X demand a right to privacy and country Y has that right of privacy, it would be wrong to assume that country X wants the same kind of privacy as in country Y. So the specificities of country X make it that the people who ask for privacy do it for different reasons than the people in country Y. And so their privacy will have a different form that universal rights for privacy will certainly overlook. And so to use Walzer's terminology, privacy is not a universal principle, but a reiterative one. It means like its meaning changes from one social context to another. So goods like privacy have a social meaning, and that means that, quote, it refers to the way in which social factors determine the reasons that people generally have for wanting to have a certain good or to be able to use it in a certain way. So an example is when society agrees that maybe it's humiliating to be observed by others, by others when you do a specific activity, and so we want to have our privacy in order to do that thing without the fear of humiliation from others. Or we don't want to be in an economic disadvantage, so we want our income or bank account to be private. So to quote Scanlon again, what I have argued above using the example of privacy amounts in Walzer's terms to the claim that answers to questions of right or wrong can depend on social meanings, because these meanings can affect the reasons people have for rejecting certain principles. But it is worth noting that Scanlon differs from Walzer in the sense that Walzer seems to imply that moral consequences are directly derived from that social meaning, which isn't what Scanlon is saying. That would make principles rely on conventions, and like we've seen with the case of promises, so last video, that is not accurate. So this counters the relativist account. If interventionism doesn't happen, it won't be like in the case of the pseudo-tolerate relativist who doesn't think about the reasons those people people in the third world, for example, would have. And so to them, it wouldn't matter if the people in question have reasonable rejections to the ways of life of their own society. When we consider the reasons that people have or may have, we can then arrive at an account that would explain why different cultures have different moral standards in which the same action can be viewed good in one society and wrong in another, without falling into moral nihilism, without falling into the idea that we have no way to establish a moral criterion for moral criticism. So it is important to remember that to be able to morally criticize someone, they have to be responsible for their actions in the ways we explained in chapter 6. But for someone to be responsible, then the moral reasons must have a moral force on them. Being unable to see the moral force of reasons would make someone unable to be open to moral criticism. And so the challenge to benign relativism is that it cannot explain or cannot account for the moral force of reasons. And this is what contractualism offers us here, an account for the moral force. We are moved by those forces when the things when the things that they involve matter to us in a way related to what we owe to each other. If you remember, we've said that when we talk about morality, we either mean it in the narrow sense, which is what we owe to each other, or the broader sense. And here Scanlon talks about the narrow sense. Quote, "The account I have offered has the advantage of explaining how in different societies, different conclusions about what is right can be justified as moral conclusions in the narrowest sense of that term. It does this without presenting these judgments as deriving from any substantive universal principle. It is certainly a benign account, and though not relativist, it explains how standards of right and wrong can have a kind of variability that relativists espouse." Now, that may be true for what we owe to each other, but what about morality in the broader sense? The account offered by Scanlon seems to solve the problem that relativism faces, but only problems in the narrow sense of morality, in the sense of things that matter to me and to other people because they impact others, or more specifically, it's about what we owe to each other. But now, what about things that are not limited to what we owe to each other? Things like valuing some works of art or the environment or some sexual practices. In the book, Scanlon mentions, again, anthropologists who shock, for example, the European ways of life regarding sexuality by revealing how many other cultures had radically different sexual practices. Of course, these can also impact what we owe to each other, but then we just have to apply the principles we discussed in the last section. If you live in a country where homosexuality gets you the death penalty, for example, then here the sexual practices are in the realm of morality in the narrow sense, or you just claim that sexuality is not a moral issue. But sexual morality, like we've already mentioned in chapter 4, isn't limited to what we owe to each other and can be grasped in the broader sense. Sexual practices can also be a matter of personal honor, like when someone doesn't want to do a certain practice because they see it as demeaning, but don't prevent others who enjoy it from practicing it. These differences, like we said in the last section, come from the fact that people have different reasons to value the same thing or different things, and those different reasons will produce different ways of valuing the same thing. So even within the sphere of positive value, we can have different ways to value that same thing. The same sexual practice can be enjoyed by different people, but they enjoy it in different ways or for different reasons. Scanlon gives the following example to demonstrate this. He says, like, imagine first there is patriotism. When people have different conceptions of patriotism, we are not going to have the same level of sacrifice that is required from patriots. We can look at these differences from a narrow perspective or a broader perspective. In a country where patriotism is simply duties towards one's fellow citizens, you are going to have a different conception than in a country where patriotism is a moral standard. You know, like in the second case, if someone didn't love their country despite fulfilling their duties towards their fellow citizens, that person would feel guilty despite the fact that what he owes to others was fulfilled. And so this is morality in the broader sense, where maybe you had an ideal image of yourself, or you said to yourself that being good is also about loving my country and sacrificing myself for it. So when you fail at that, you feel guilty, even though you didn't violate anything that you owe to others. This is like the case of Adam Smith and the highwayman that we saw in the chapter on promises just last week, where the promise isn't binding, so you don't owe anything to the highwayman, but from from your relationship to yourself, you did a dick move when you didn't fulfill that promise. So it's like saying, you know, real men keep their promises, even the not binding ones. So these are basically cases of when someone stays true to themselves and do something that is admirable, even though they were put in circumstances that would make it understandable to do the opposite. For example, you can think of cases where you don't sell your soul under torture. That can be, you know, an example of morality in the broader sense. You can also think of family relations where someone would help a second or a third cousin when they don't have to. They'd say something like, you know, nothing is stronger than family, and so if someone is part of your family, you have to do what it takes to help them, even if they are the biggest assholes ever, for example. That's a moral stand that's more about the principle or the character of the person doing it than what that person owes to others. So all of these moral ideals, and they can differ from one society to another. Even if two societies have the same ideal, they can differ on the ways to apply it, and like if they can agree on the same ideal, but they would differ in how to apply it, or to what extent can we apply it, how much sacrificing yourself for your family, honor, or country, etc. is. All of this is framed within this idea. Now, these differences bring us to what really concerns us here, which is, according to Scanlon, quote, the possibility of a plurality of such moral ideals raises two questions, both of which concern how someone who holds an ideal should view others who do not hold it. So this is what we said about sexual practices. Like, if I consider a practice as demeaning, how am I to see someone who practice it? A famous case is prostitution. Like, many see prostitution as demeaning and would blame the prostitutes for doing that activities. They would call them whores or sluts as insults, or they just see them as victims who were forced into that activity, and so they'd lose their they'd lose their shit when they see someone who could have chosen another job become a sex worker. So what do you do when we have these different moral ideals? So as we said, there are two questions. The first one is, are those ideals personal preferences? And so the argument is that if you say that I hold an ideal, and those who don't hold that ideal are not committing any fault, then whether I have or not that ideal wouldn't make any normative difference. Thinking that patriotism requires that you sacrifice your life for your country now seems as trivial as saying that my favorite food is pasta, for example. People who see prostitution as bad, they seem to say that for them, sexual integrity is like their favorite ice cream or their favorite music band. We've already talked about this, and we've seen that People don't like to think that their moral ideals are trivial, like personal preferences, and that's because of what we said in chapter 1 about the universality of reasons. Like, if I have reasons that others can understand and submit to moral criticism, then it means that my reasons for holding an ideal isn't just a matter of preferences. And for the second question, it's about the attitude we ought to have towards people who don't share those ideals. What attitude should I have towards someone who doesn't share my ideal of patriotism or of promises or of family, etc.? So this is related to what we've said also in chapter 4. The broad sense of morality actually depends on the narrow sense too. And also what we said about moral significance. The things I hold morally significant, even in the broader sense, are going to shape my sense of morals in the narrow sense. So answering these questions means that we have to make an argument that defends plurality of ideals without turning them into preferences and without turning those ideals into universal principles either. So let's start with the first question. So Scanlon says that there is something mistaken about the question that it's just because it's just because something is a preference doesn't necessarily make it trivial. Many things that we consider are of our personal preferences, but they have a central role to play in our lives and our relationships with others. Our tastes in music, our favorite food, etc., can actually be good grounds for providing us with moral reasons. Same thing with chance. People sometimes feel that they have a certain ideal because they happen to be born in a place where that ideal is highly valued and shared by others, and so it's not to the merit of the ideal that they are moved. It's not the merit of the idea that they are being moved by, but because that's what they encountered in their life. But they don't have to see it like that. Again, those contingencies don't take away our capacity for thinking about the ideals that we have in the sense of wondering what reasons there can be to hold them. As Scanlon says, when there are good reasons for taking one's ideal to be worthy of respect, these also provide good reasons for adhering to it, even if other contingent factors determine which ideal one will adopt, and even if other ideals would also have been worthy of adherence. Now, the second question is a little bit tricky, since we've seen that our values, just because they are preferences or contingencies, that doesn't mean that they are trivial. Then it means that since they are normative, they are going to have an impact on others. So how to deal with people who don't share those values? Well, first we can deal with them like in the case of the established practice principle. If they don't value the same thing as we do because they are missing something, then we either try to make them see it or simply impose those values. But we have to remember that it is okay to impose those values only if our values are backed up by reasons and principles that those who don't share those values cannot reject. If the people who don't share your values have good reasons to reject them, then it means two things. Either you don't even have good reasons to value the things that you value, or they have equally good reasons to value things that you don't value. Like, if we take the example of patriotism again, if you value patriotism but someone else doesn't, this can go in the following ways. If you have good reasons to value patriotism, but the other seems unmoved by that value, if they are unmoved because of laziness or self-indulgence, they'd be open to moral criticism, since laziness or self-indulgence are not good reasons to reject patriotism. But if they are not moved by patriotism because the form of patriotism that you are presenting is, I don't know, maybe it's pretty disturbing, like maybe it's a little bit fascist. It's a fascist form of patriotism that can only work if we identify an enemy of the nation and turn them into scapegoats for our anger. Then they obviously have good reasons to reject that value. And even and they can even ask you to justify that shit, and you're gonna have a very hard time doing that. You'd be the one who is open to moral criticism here. But in but in the third case, which Scanlon brings, where you have no reasons to object to patriotism, but aren't moved by it because you have reasons to value something else, like you are committed to an ideal of personal independence, and as we said, you have good reasons to hold it, then we are in a situation where both people have different values that they both have good reasons to commit to. And so here the only thing to do is just to respect each other. Sure, a gulf would separate us, like if I value personal independence as much as you, for example, value patriotism, there's going to be a gulf that separates us, but at least we won't look down on each other, and more importantly, we will still see each other as reasonable, independent human beings worthy of respect. And so here someone can object by saying, what about people who don't value justification for others? What would Scanlon do in those cases? How would he, look at them? Would he look at them with respect? And so, as we've also explained in chapter 4 about the scope of morality, even those who are not moved by reasons are still part of the sphere of morality in the narrower sense. So someone who doesn't value justification for others would still be respected, but that's because such person would have some severe deficiency in thought. It would be like either a child or an animal or a handicapped person, because if you don't value justification, then you cannot justify why you don't value justification. Unless you're a psychopathic, cynical dude, such people would be treated like we treat children, or animals or any other beings in that category. But since those beings are still entitled to some things from us, we have to treat them with the appropriate respect. And so the gulf between us and them is surely, it can be wide, but it is manageable. So to go back to people with normal rational abilities, Scanlon says, to be sure, even if such people should not look down on each other, they are still separated in an important way by their commitments. But this is, as I have argued, a different and less serious kind of gulf that separates us from those who are unmoved by the requirements of justifiability to others. People who are separated in this way value different things, but can still recognize each other as valuable. So in other words, when people have different ideals, which of course they do, people have different lives, different interests, different circumstances, and so different reasons to value what they value. The trick is to justify those reasons. When ideals are incompatible with each other, if they are both backed up by reasons or principles that we cannot reject, there is nothing we can do besides recognize and respect each other. That's how societies work. You'll never find a society that doesn't have this conflict of ideals among its members. True, a certain ideal will be more shared by the members than other ideals, but the number of people who have a common ideal has no basis in whether or not the others must adopt it too. So instead, for ideals to apply to even to those who reject it, there has to be specific conditions and reasons that those who reject the ideal cannot reject. Like they cannot reject those conditions. For example, Scanlon mentions Rawls' concept of fairness, which states, quote, "If an ideal of sacrifice for the common good is fair, then a person who has voluntarily accepted the benefits of others' compliance with this ideal can be obliged to sacrifice in turn." So what this principle argues is that if you do not agree with the principle, but you accepted the ways in which others are benefiting from it and see their reasons for wanting to benefit from it, then if that principle requires some sacrifice from you, like others, they did their part, you kind of have to take your turn as well. In other words, if I see that other people have some sort of ideal and they are benefiting from it, and I can understand their reasons and find no valuable objection to it, but I don't agree to that ideal, or I am committed to another. If that ideal also depends on my contribution, then I have to contribute as well. Like if you have the opportunity to contribute to an ideal that you don't necessarily hold, but know that others that that ideal matters to others, and you can see that they have good reasons for wanting that ideal to hold, like it's a fair ideal, for example, then you have to do what is required of you to do from that ideal. Like if you know that your family is counting on you or expecting you to do something that would benefit their ideal, and if you don't do that, they will suffer some loss. And if the ideal is fair, even if you don't agree with it or don't hold it, you are still required to do that thing, even if you personally won't benefit from it. Another way for ideals to impose themselves, and again, when we don't have reasons to reject them, is when the ideals that we hold depend on the existence of an ideal that we don't. Like some ideals affect the range of ideals available to us. Like some ideals restrict how many ideals people can have, while others would allow people to have a wider range of options. A society that has an ideal related to a practice that has some xenophobic elements to it makes it difficult for strangers to have and express their own ideals. But in a true democratic society, not only strangers can have the opportunity to express their own ideals, but even the members who hold the ideals of the other society can also practice that ideal without, the xenophobic elements. So ideals can not only affect the range of ideals for the members, but the individuals too. Like someone can become blind to other ideals available that can be better better than the one he holds. And so Scanlon gives the following example. Like suppose that you live in a country with vast inequalities, so let's say a capitalist country, and you do care about the plight of those who are unfortunate. You genuinely want to help and are aware of the injustice that you have. You are aware of the injustice that you have some sort of privileges while others don't, and more importantly, you understand their objections to the practices of your society from which you are benefiting and from which your privileges come from. But despite that, you don't reject those practices because you don't see any alternative to it. You genuinely believe that without capitalism, things will be worse. It would be tyranny, and everyone would be even poorer than the poorest unfortunate who begs you to reject these practices. If you ever had a conversation with a capitalist, that's what they will tell you. Like it's sad that there are inequalities, but we don't have any other alternative, any other ideal that isn't private property and abstract human rights is just barbary and tyranny. Like they overestimate the capitalists. They overestimate the cost of giving up on those privileges and practices. Now we already talked about a case like this one, and it was in the chapter on responsibility, so chapter 6. It was with the example of the friend who is genuinely trying to be a good friend, but didn't buy her friend a gift because she couldn't see any reason for that. Since we said that she's open to moral criticism, the same criticism applies here to the capitalist as well, or to anyone who holds an oppressive ideal which doesn't allow them to see that there are many other alternatives that don't have this oppressive cost, and that the cost for giving up those ideals isn't even that high. Now, In relation to relativism, this solves the problem that relativists are often reluctant to call out, oppressive practices in other cultures. Like we all know the relativist who is always, debunking their own culture, but is reluctant to do so with the culture of others, even when that culture is more oppressive than theirs. Relativists can be victim of this line of thought, as they'll think that any ideals different from relativism will be worse than relativism, or the universalist will think that any deviance from universalism will lead to relativist nihilism. So the account of Scanlon solves the fear of the relativist, since it criticizes other cultures on the grounds of their own standards, by showing that the standards are demanding and pointing that the people who want to live by them are not living up to those standards, or by pointing that those standards are needlessly narrowing the range of valid ideals that members of their societies have good reasons to hold and want. Now, with all of this, we can now turn to the nature of Scanlon's contractualism. Now, is contractualism a relativist philosophy, or holds universal principles? So Scanlon says that his contractualism has basically three concentric domains. A central core, then there is a social domain, and then there is the domain of particular values. So let's start with the first domain. The central core contains those judgments of right or wrong that hold everywhere. So contractualism first looks at whether a judgment of right or wrong would hold in all societies. Like, we ask if everyone in any society would have good reasons to hold judgment X. If the answer is yes, then the judgment is valid. And an example is a principle that prevents you to kill someone for pleasure, or because you don't like their face, or because of who they hang out with, or something like that. The second domain would be beyond this, is the domain of judgments of right or wrong that depend on reasons for rejection that people have only under certain social conditions. So these are judgments that would depend on the kind of society we're talking about. If the society in question has good reasons for holding that judgment, then we consider the judgment valid. This is what we've seen with judgments like it's wrong to invade someone's privacy. It needs a certain social context to be valid. And then there is the third domain. Quote, judgments in the third domain differ in some more significant way, since they are based on the idea of what we owe to others, but on the appeal since they are not, based on the idea of what we owe to each other, but on the appeal of particular values that we may share. So these are the ones we talked about just now. This is when you have different ideals, but they are both valid and can be incompatible with each other, or the standards of the society that they are in. We've talked about what to do in those situations when neither one is open to moral criticism, yet both have incompatible ideals or principles. In those cases, the only thing to do, since we cannot react with indignation to the ideal itself, we can only react to how the individual is acting on that ideal. Like, if they are not living up to it, we can only point at their hypocrisy, but it won't be a moral criticism since we don't share that ideal too. So we cannot say that by failing to live up to that ideal, the person violates principles in the narrow sense of morality, principles of what we owe to each other. So the fact that we don't share their ideals means that they don't owe us anything related to that ideal. So in that sense, the only people who can morally criticize the person are people who share the same ideal. And so this again, and it is important, this again only applies when the ideals are not open to moral criticism. If someone has an ideal and that ideal is negatively affecting you, then the ideal is open to moral criticism. So if I don't share your ideal and that ideal is making me suffer some harm unfairly and for reasons that I can reasonably reject, then I can criticize you. But if you are failing to live up to its standards and no one has reasons to reject the ideal, then only those who share that ideal can morally criticize you. But we're still wondering how disagreements about what is right and wrong emerge in the first place, and what is the proper way to solve them when we can solve them. All this talk about tolerance is good, but we also need to understand how disagreements work. Maybe there are cases where we arrive at some sort of dead end between ideals, but those are dead ends only because we don't have a way of solving disagreements. If saying that an action is wrong means, as Scanlon puts it, to claim at least that it is forbidden by standards that there is good reasons to regard as requirements whose violation merits serious criticism, or put simply, an action is wrong if it violates some standards that have some requirements. So you do something that normally moral standards require you not to do, and if you violate that, there is something about those requirements that make you that makes you deserve some serious criticism. For example, stealing is wrong means that morality requires that you don't take what is someone else's without their permission, and we consider that requirement to be important to the extent that when you steal, you deserve to be criticized. So if that is what is meant by an action is wrong, then disagreements about right or wrong means disagreement about whether the standards requirements in question are important to the extent that if you violate them, you actually deserve criticism. We can do this in at least two ways. We either disagree about the content of those standards or the level of authority or importance that they have. So disagreements of this kind are disagreement about what the philosopher David Wong mentioned in a footnote. He calls adequate moral systems. For example, utilitarians can disagree with Scannon's contractualism in both views. They can disagree about the content of moral standards and authority. For utilitarians, what should count as a requirement for moral standard is how much pain and pleasure is produced by actions. And they say that since happiness as pleasure is the best measurement we have compared to other things we value, we can consider that a moral system that puts pleasure, the authority of deciding what is right and wrong, is an adequate moral system. Because these are tricky questions, and it's quite difficult to know what is the proper content and authority of standards, some would place authority based on some sort of divine authority. Like we know we have the adequate moral system because it comes from God, for example. God gave us the content and the authority. But here we are doing philosophy, so we try to answer those questions without really appealing to God. So let's see how we can solve disagreements of this kind. When philosophical inquiry tries to solve right and wrong issues, it does it also in two but conflicting ways. First, philosophy has what Scanlon calls an interpretive aim. It sees that in our daily experiences we hold moral values, and so it seeks to understand what kind of reasons we have to value those values and give them moral significance and authority. Second, there is the critical aim, which seeks to understand how those reasons provide that authority. Like, do the reasons I claim that someone has for valuing a certain standard actually have the force that I am attributing to them? And also, we ask if the reasons we identify are actually good reasons, or if there are better ones, better better reasons that can provide that authority. So for example, you see someone helping someone else, you try to figure out what are their reasons. They tell you it's out of self-interest. You ask, do you do that with every act of kindness you ever did? They say, for example, yes. So you only help when it's in your self-interests. They answer yes. Okay, now we have. This is where we have to work. So let's see if moral actions can be moved by such reasons, and if we can have better reasons for acts or for acts of kindness, then it's in my self-interests. So we do two things here. We quote, identify morality with what is required by that particular source of authority that we are perhaps incorrectly aware of as standing behind the standards of conduct we commonly recognize as moral. In this case, it is self-interest. Then the second thing we did, we may take take morality to be what is required by those principles that there is most reason, whatever these reasons may be, to take as ultimate standard of conduct, the violation of which merits serious criticism. Now, we say that these two aims are conflicting because one is correct. One is concrete, sorry, because one is concrete, like it's there, the person is aware of it, but the second is more abstract. So it seems that each of these aims pulls us in a different direction. One is just descriptive, it tells you what reasons people have, while the other is more prescriptive, as it wants people to be critical of their reasons and look for better ones, you know, that they should have. Or we ask ourselves, why should we have the set of values that we have instead of another set? Now, this isn't much of an issue because these two conflicting aims aren't really conflicting at all. That's because in philosophy, conflicting things tend to overlap, and what was first thought to be two processes turns out to be one and the same thing. That's because doing a descriptive account of moral reasons cannot be done without also like systematically doing a prescriptive account as well. You cannot do one without the other, and that's because when people try to tell you what reasons they have, there's what Richard Moran, another philosopher that Scanlon mentions in a footnote, calls the problem of the transparency of first-person attribution to mental states. This means that when someone attributes to themselves their mental states, we think it's transparent, like what the person says about their mental states is true, but in reality they can be wrong. So when someone tells you that's my reason, we can doubt the accuracy of that statement. We are not very clear or straightforward with our reasons for taking standards as having moral significance. And the reason why we are not sure, it's because, well, moral reasons have their appeal because they appear to us as good or tend towards something good. So when people have a moral reason, they must already believe that their reason must reflect this idea of something good, which means that they also have an idea about bad reasons as well. So whatever reason someone has, it must be a reason they got from some sort of assessment among many other reasons that are like candidates for the good reasons to adopt, So people adopt reasons because those are the reasons they should have. Like if I adopt reason X, it's because I'm looking for the reasons that I should have, and reason X seems to be one. But then I can be wrong. Maybe reason X isn't the one I should have. A descriptive account must also include this, whether or not reason X is truly the reason that I should have. And if it is not, then I can't be like, oh, okay, I guess I don't have the reason that I should have, and be done with it. No, the descriptive account is also telling me that I have to discard those reasons and to look for the ones I should have. So the descriptive account in morality is also a prescriptive account. So to quote Scanlon, determining what we believe, what we believe is in most cases a matter of deciding what to believe. So the content of morality and the reasons supporting its authority cannot be two different questions. Okay, any account of right or wrong must answer those two parts of the same question. So contractualism, according to Scanlon, can do that. It offers an explanation for our reasons through the presence and exchange of with others. By owing our reasons to other people, we come to practice critical self-understanding. And what's great about the book actually is that it literally shows that, like, everyone Scanlon mentions in the footnotes is someone to whom Scanlon shows a lot of gratitude. He thanks them for their conversations and reading their books and articles, which contributed to formulating his own philosophy and further understandings of his own reasons. Like, you really can feel that this book, this work, took 18 years. It took 18 years, and he didn't spend those 18 years in isolation, like philosophizing in isolation, like from an ivory tower. But he was in constant conversation with friends, relatives, colleagues, and students. Like in the show The Good Place, it's through others that the characters become good people, by helping each other and helping each other better understand who they are and who they ought to become. Now, this process, Scanlon insists, isn't to create a consensus among moral views. If by being ethical and having the right reasons, like we apply contractualism, like Scanlon prescribes, if by that if we think that this will lead us to a state where everyone finally agrees on what is the right thing to do, what's the content of morality and what reasons should have authority, then we didn't get the point of contractualism. This is not to create a unifying theory of morality. This is not an inquiry on how to make everyone agree on morality. Some, as he says, can use contractualism for that, but instead of questioning their reasons, they can become more convinced of them. Some would say that through contractualism, I became more religious or something. People would still disagree about what is right or wrong. You still have people who will condemn homosexuality, and for different reasons. I don't see what reasons that we cannot reject, that condemn homosexuality, but Scanlon simply leaves it open. But you'd still have people like that. Just like you'd have people who celebrate it or accept it for also different reasons. Like with the promise to the highwayman, Scanlon says that it is wrong to break the promise based on his notion of what we owe to each other, whereas Adam Smith says that it's wrong based on the notion of self-respect or honor. So we can wonder whether that's problematic, because when people don't share the same values, we don't know how they will treat us. People who don't share my values, I don't know how they will treat me. They can be a threat to us, right? And Scanlon acknowledges this. He acknowledges this by saying that a person who isn't moved by ideals of what we owe to each other can be a threat. But again, so would we to that person, right? In the case of Smith, he says that someone can be moved by other reasons than what we owe to each other in order to be nice. They can do it out of honor or of noble, because of noblesse oblige. Such person wouldn't be a threat to us, but their values will affect our relationship to them nonetheless, and vice versa. And quote, the question to be asked is, in each case, is exactly what these effects would be. Now, these disagreements can be about the requirements of certain standards, like we agree on the standards but disagree on the requirements. Or it can be about which standards can have authority, but the disagreements about a conduct in general are more problematic because, as Scanlon says, they disagree about morality only in the abstract sense in which morality is understood to refer to those principles, whether they may be that there is most reason whatever kind, to accept as ultimate standards of conduct, the violation of which merits serious criticism. So, when we are in such situation, there are, according to contractualism, three things to do. First, we ask about the reasons for holding such principles and see if they are good reasons. We already explained the method to assess whether reasons are good or not from chapter 1. So, if we are convinced that the reasons backing up that principle are good, then even if we have no reason to buy into that principle, we still need to respect it or see it as a reasonable position to hold. So in such cases, we see to what extent their principles overlap with ours, or to what extent they converge. This is Walter's lip service argument that people with conflicting ideals must take into account the ideals of others when those ideals are as valid as the dominant ones, and guarantee their respect and recognition, or pay lip service to the interests of those people. So if a moral view can be oppressive to some members of society, there has to be pressure on that view to exclude from it principles that those members can reasonably reject. In other words, even the most religious societies must have golden rules for the people who diverge from the norm. And so such measures are significant because they are about a question that is fundamental in ethics, which isn't what principles or standards we value, but how we value other people. Now, one last question is left, which is, what shall we do with our own beliefs once we encounter disagreement? Should we modify them, keep them? The fact that such disagreements exist is often seen as an argument in favor of relativism, that there are no fixed principles of morality. But with that knowledge in mind, well, what do we do now? When we see that other cultures have different ideals than ours, it leads to ask the question, quote, what ground is there, the relativists ask, for thinking that we, rather than they, have got it right? It is more plausible, they say, to conclude that there is nothing there to be right about, that is no objective truth about morality. So, is that really the case? Is there nothing to be right in morality? Can't we say that what I believe, morally speaking, is right or objective? Well, let's see how Scanlon answers this final question. Throughout the book, we say that if something is going to give force to our moral judgment, is the reasons that we have to hold such judgments. We also said from the beginning of this long reading that what matters isn't the metaphysical status of those judgments or reasons. Like, if I say that killing babies is wrong, in order for that claim to be right or objective, I don't need that claim to exist outside of me, like to have a metaphysical existence independent of my own or the content of my mind. Instead, for that claim to be right or to be true, it just needs me to have the right reasons for thinking that it is right. So it's about thinking about such matters, but in the right way. The problem, Scanlon says, is that when we have people thinking in the right way but arriving at different conclusions, our confidence in our reasons is put into question. We have to explain why people who think in the same way, meaning the right way, would arrive at different conclusions. A possibility given by the philosopher J.L. Mackie is that people actually arrive at different conclusions because they are valuing different things. To quote him, in short, the argument from relativity has some force simply because the actual variations in moral codes are more readily explained by the hypothesis that they reflect ways of life than by the hypothesis that they represent perceptions, most of them seriously inadequate and badly distorted, of objective values. So, our ways of life, meaning experiences, customs, traditions, history, etc., our ways of life are bound to lead us to value different things that others wouldn't value even if we are thinking in the right way about those values. So in other words, having a way to think can lead to disagreements when we apply it to different things. People can just say that the object of our thought isn't the right one, or we are thinking in the right way about the wrong thing, like we are valuing the wrong things despite thinking in the right way. So for me, someone who has the right morals would be someone who thinks in the right way about the right thing, meaning someone who values the things that I value for the same reasons as I have. So a relativist would object to this either on the grounds that there is no right way to think about something, or that there is no right thing. People think how they think about whatever thing that that their culture gives them to think about. And so this relativist argument leads to the conclusion that moral judgments cannot be judgment that can be said to be objectively true or false. But for Scanlon, this conclusion is a non sequitur, meaning a fallacious argument in which the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises, saying that different people value different things despite thinking in the right way, or value the same thing differently, leads us to conclude that we cannot say that moral judgments cannot be true or false. That simply doesn't follow. He argues instead, since we've seen how seldom people take on the challenge of self-criticism, like we rarely do what Scanlon did or is doing, because well, most of us maybe don't see reasons to doubt the reasons that we already have, and we've also seen that people are often mistaken in the reasons that they attribute to themselves. Then maybe the reason why we don't seem to be able to judge moral claims on the basis of their truthworthiness stems from the fact that we just don't try hard enough. Who knows? The relativist can say that, okay, most people don't try they don't try hard enough, so we can say that it's impossible to apply criteria of truth and falsehood to moral judgments, but there surely are well-informed people who tried very hard, and yet we get to the same results. So what do you do then when the conditions of trying hard were actually met, And so in such cases, Scanlon argues that there are only 4 possibilities. One party is mistaken. 2, the other party is mistaken. 3, both are mistaken. 4, neither is mistaken, because there is nothing to be mistaken about in cases of this kind. Now, we just need to know which one of these possibilities is more likely to be true in cases of disagreement. Scanlon quickly rules out option 4, because that possibility would be true only in extreme and rare situations. When people take their time to investigate their moral beliefs, they tend to form either same beliefs about the natural world, they tend to have the same facts, and those facts change their moral judgment. So it's very unlikely that people with the same facts about the same things would have different moral judgments. When people disagree on abortion or the treatment of non-human animals, it's likely that we have also disagreements about sexuality, about women bodies, metaphysical properties about the world, etc. So the claim there's nothing to be mistaken about doesn't seem really plausible. And even when there is nothing to be mistaken about, as in facts, let's say, we can still be mistaken about the method used to arrive at those facts. And so here we are talking about the reasons we have for believing whatever we believed. This too happens in science, as Scanlon says. Disagreements about which of several competing scientific hypotheses is best supported by the available evidence, for example, often persist even among inquirers who are experts in the field. So if we have same facts and same reasons/methods, we are not going to find disagreements. I mean, we are less likely, very unlikely, to find disagreements. So if you are not mistaken about the facts and the reasons for believing those facts, there won't be disagreements. So So the fourth option is kind of irrelevant. So we are just stuck with either one is mistaken or both of them are mistaken. And as we said, what is important in moral judgments is the reasons for such belief and not really the facts. Since the facts are always threatened by doubt, if you believe in the wrong fact but for the right reasons, then we cannot say that you are open to moral criticism, right? So if mistake there is, it must be mostly on the grounds of reasons than simple natural facts. Being mistaken about reasons means that we gave importance and priority to reasons over better or good reasons. Now, how do we know that we are mistaken? Well, since morality is about what we owe to each other, we cannot know on our own if we have the right reasons. Becoming aware of that comes in the form of criticism, which comes from other people. By rejecting your reasons or principles, you can become aware that there is something wrong. So disagreement is bound to happen if others reject your reasons. And what can people object to? Well, mostly reasons are rejected on the grounds that they affect negatively or unfairly other people. So if that's the case, if the negative impact is caused by our reasons, we need to either show that we have special justification to hold those reasons, and a special justification means that you cannot do otherwise. For example, if you do things otherwise, it puts a burden on you that everyone else would agree that you have good reasons for not wanting. But as history knows, people who want to justify their reasons tend to overestimate the cost or burden, and so resist to change their conduct. That fear of an overestimated cost can be self-interest, of course, but it can also be the fear of losing something we consider deeply valuable, even though I don't personally get benefit from it. A value like resilience can play that role for people who oppose euthanasia. Like for example, loyalty and commitment to people who oppose abortion. They believe that agreeing with abortion would mean that commitment and loyalty or responsibility are devalued, and they think that that would be a great loss. Like someone who thinks that a natural, in the same way that someone who thinks that a natural park is of great value for other reasons than just ecology. So we can think about the difficulty of perception and the limits it imposes on our intellectual capacities. We may say that morality is too complex for human beings to get it right, given how easily our senses, emotions, biases can distort our perception. It would take a superhuman being to be able to tell us what is the right thing to do without making a mistake. But even so, the fact that morality also relies on imagination and leaps of faith doesn't mean that we have to be relativists and say that there is no truth or falsehood in morality. Science is, after all, pretty complex and is challenging. It is as challenging as moral inquiry, yet people in science don't give up on the idea that statements can be true or false just because all theories at one point become obsolete, right? If it works for science, why not the same logic in morality? Sure, it's difficult and maybe moral progress is a long way to go, but as Scanlon says, inquiry of this kind may not yield systematic theories or novel principles that give clear directives about what to do in difficult cases. It may even make some decisions more difficult or at least more complex by dislodging overly simple understandings of the relevant moral considerations. But it is not as insignificant it's not an insignificant form of progress, and it is, I believe, the form of progress that philosophical reflection is most likely to provide. And there we can finally conclude. So throughout the book, Scanlon wanted to give an account of morality that describes best how we function when we make moral judgments. Like when I say that this is wrong or this is right, what kind of cognitive process I am doing exactly. And it seems that a lot of the confusion that surrounds morality comes from an an accurate understanding of that process. So getting an accurate understanding of what it would of what we are doing when we make a moral judgment would certainly help us treat others and ourselves more ethically. So to go through the structure of the book again, the book has two parts, if you recall. Part one is about reasons and values, which has three chapters: reasons, values, and well-being. In that part, Scanlon wanted to find the base unit of moral and practical reasoning, and he identified that unit with reasons. When we want to understand moral reasoning, what we should do when someone says X is wrong is ask, what reasons do you have for thinking that X is wrong? And then we see if those are good reasons for thinking that way. And by good reasons, we mean reasons that we cannot reasonably reject, or we cannot reject on reasonable grounds. Then in the second part, which is about right and wrong, we looked at the implications of taking, reasons as the motivational unit of value judgment and behavior, or as Scanlon calls them, judgment-sensitive attitudes, and he focused on the attitudes that concern morality or what we owe to each other more specifically. So basically we look at how we can determine whether or not a reason can be significantly moral and valid. For Scanlon, a reason is moral and valid if we can justify it to others on grounds that they cannot reasonably reject. If no one can reject your reasons for doing X, then X is not wrong. Since there can be many reasons or principles, let's say, that we cannot reject, Scanlon's philosophy, that he calls contractualism, doesn't look for consensus among moral values. Instead, it recognizes the existence of disagreements and explains how to deal with those disagreements without denying them. Hence, Scanlon has what we call a pluralistic view of morality. There are many principles and many reasons that we cannot reject, but Scanlon didn't tell us what those are specifically. As he himself says, I have not, for example, offered a systematic account of how reasons for rejecting proposed principles are to be formulated and their strength assessed. Instead, he just focused on telling us which ones are not, and how we can identify the reasons that we can reject. So well-being, for example, is a reason that is rarely relevant to back up the justification of an action, and he argues that we cannot have a well-defined set of reasons, nor a definite and systemic theory of identifying them, or even a unified theory of morality. The only thing that we can be sure of is that such an inquiry, whether it's always an open one or not, doesn't matter. What matters is that such inquiry requires the assistance of others, and it is also a necessary inquiry. So as he says during the end of the book, these reasons require us to strive to find terms of justification that others could not reasonably reject. But we are not in a position to say once and for all what these terms should be. Working out the terms of moral justification is an unending task. And that's it. We finished the 8 chapters of the book, but we still have one thing to go through, and that is the appendix at the end of the book, and we will cover that next time. So this is the appendix here, and once we finish that, we will be officially done with What We Owe to Each Other by T.M. Scanlon, and we can finally move to the next book I'm going to explain. So thank you very much. I hope that you enjoy this series of videos on what we owe to each other. Hopefully you find them helpful, and feel free to ask anything that you want in the comment section, and